The assembly rooms at Aldermere had not changed in 10 years, and Eleanor Marchmont had come to find a strange comfort in that. The same water-stained ceiling rose overhead in its plaster garlands. The same 3 chandeliers dripped the same tallow onto the same scarred floor. The same matrons sat along the same wall in the same order of precedence they had occupied since the reign of the old king, and the same country dances scraped along under the same tired fiddles, played now, as they had been then, by the elder Mr. Croft and his unfortunate nephew. She sat in the chair she had claimed an hour before, in the little alcove by the long window where the draught came through in winter and the heat gathered in autumn, and she had every intention of keeping it until the candles guttered and the carriages were called. From here she could watch the whole room without being obliged to join a single moment of it, the young ladies fresh from the schoolroom turning in their first proper gowns, the mammas totting up fortunes behind their fans, old Admiral Cray asleep upright in his chair with a glass of negus balanced on his knee as though he had been poured there along with it. "You are doing the thing again," said Aunt Hen, arriving at her elbow in a rustle of grey silk and the particular sharp lavender water she had worn since before Eleanor was born. "The thing where you become a piece of the wall. I have watched 3 separate gentlemen look directly at that window and conclude there was no one sitting in front of it. That is the appeal of the chair, Aunt. It is very restful being furniture. Furniture does not have opinions about the punch. The punch is watered. That is not an opinion. That is a fact several people would thank me for stating aloud." Aunt Hen, to everyone under 60 and to a surprising number of people over it, lowered herself into the neighboring chair with the particular grunt of a woman who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of sitting down without appearing to have exerted herself in the smallest degree. She was Eleanor's father's sister, unmarried by choice rather than misfortune, as she was at some pains to remind anyone who pitied her for it, and she had lived at Marchmont Grange for as long as Eleanor could remember, occupying the peculiar and useful role of a woman with nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear, saying, "Your mother has been watching the door for the better part of 20 minutes, Aunt Hen said. Not watching it the way a woman watches for a late supper. Watching it the way a woman watches for a comet. Mama watches doors on principle. It is her chief occupation now that Frederick has stopped bringing home debts she can be shocked by in company. He has not stopped bringing them home. He has simply stopped mentioning the sum." Aunt Hen's fan moved in short, decisive strokes that stirred the candle-warmed air between them. "But that is not why she is watching the door tonight, and you know it perfectly well, because you have not touched your lemonade in a quarter of an hour, and your foot has not stopped its little tapping since the Fenshaws came in and said his name in the cloakroom loudly enough to reach Derby." Eleanor did not ask which name. There was only one name in Aldermere that autumn that anyone said loudly enough to reach Derby, and she had known it was coming, had known it the way one knows a storm is coming from the particular stillness of the air, days before the first cloud shows itself over the hill. Sir James Hawke had come home. 10 years gone to India as a penniless younger son with nothing to his name but a good education and a worse prospects, and he had come home a baronet with £30,000 a year and an estate at Whitcomb that had stood shut up and administered by lawyers since his uncle died without an heir to trouble himself with. The whole county had talked of nothing else for a fortnight. Eleanor had listened to every word of it with her hands folded and her face arranged, exactly as she had arranged it for 10 years whenever his name came up at a dinner table, which it did with a regularity that suggested Providence had a very particular and not entirely kind sense of humor. "I am not watching the door," she said now. "No," Aunt Hen agreed. "You are watching the window, which happens to give a very fine reflection of the door, and has done since your grandfather had it glazed, which I begin to suspect is precisely why you chose this chair in the first place, and not because it is restful." Eleanor said nothing to that because there was nothing to say that would not be a lie, and she had never been a good liar even to herself. She kept her eyes on the dark glass, where the whole bright room hung suspended and reversed, the chandeliers, the dancers, the long table of negus and biscuits, and beneath it all, faint as a held breath, the door. It opened at 9:30, precisely the hour a man arrives who does not wish to be thought either too eager or too grand to trouble himself with punctuality at all, and the room did the thing that rooms do when a fortune walks into them. It did not stop, nothing so vulgar as that, but it slowed, the way a stream slows around a stone, every head turning by careful degrees, every conversation dropping half a tone so as to leave room for the observation everyone intended to make about him within the hour. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps only broader, 10 years of a harder climate and harder work having planed away whatever softness a gentleman's idle youth leaves on a man's frame. His coat was dark and well cut in the way that spoke of a London tailor rather than the County Assembly's usual compromise, and his hair, which had been fair and unruly at 22, had darkened and been disciplined into something that still, she noted with an ache she resented herself for, wanted very much to fall forward over his brow the moment he stopped attending to it. He was not looking about the room to be admired. That was the first thing she noticed, watching him in the black glass with her heart going harder than the tired fiddles warranted. He was looking for someone. She did not turn her head. She had learned long ago, across 3 long seasons before she had quietly given up on seasons altogether, that turning one's head toward an arriving gentleman was the surest way to discover he had been looking for the girl behind you. So she sat with her eyes on the window and let the glass do the watching for her, and felt the exact moment his gaze found the alcove, found the shape of her in the dark pane, and stopped. "Oh," said Aunt Hen very softly, in the voice of a woman watching a very good hand played at cards. "Oh, my dear." "Do not," Eleanor said. "I have said nothing. You have said 'oh, my dear,' which from you is an entire paragraph." He was crossing the room. She could hear it before she could bring herself to look. The small disturbance of it, the way conversation broke and reformed in his wake, the way Mrs. Fenshaw's fan stopped moving entirely, the way her own mother, over by the negus table, went so still and so pale that Aunt Hen muttered something uncharitable about smelling salts under her breath. Eleanor kept her eyes on the window a moment longer because she was not yet ready, because 10 years was a great deal of practice at composing a face and she was not going to waste the last 3 seconds of it, and then she turned, because there are limits to what even 10 years of practice can accomplish, and looked at him directly for the first time since she was 18 years old. He stopped a few feet from her chair. Up close he was worse than the glass had promised, or better, which she had learned a long time ago amounted to very nearly the same danger. His eyes had not changed at all. That was the thing that undid her, more than the coat, more than the title, more than the 10 years of sun that had darkened his skin to a shade the local matrons would spend the winter disapproving of. His eyes were exactly as they had been the last time she had looked into them, across the stile at the bottom of the orchard, with the rain just beginning and neither of them willing to be the first to walk away. "Miss Marchmont," he said. "Sir James." She was distantly, coldly proud of how steady her voice came out. "The county has talked of nothing else for a fortnight. I confess I had begun to think they had invented you." Something moved at the corner of his mouth, not quite the old smile, but its ghost, worn and careful, as though he had been rationing it for the crossing. "I assure you I am entirely real, though I have had 10 years to consider whether it might have been simpler for everyone if I were not." "You have grown philosophical. It does not suit you. You were always better at being merely aggravating." "I have had a great deal of time at sea to practice both." His gaze had not once left her face, and there was something in it she could not immediately name, something that sat oddly beside the polished ease of his bow and the careful neutrality of his voice, as though a man had learned to arrange his features and to welcome the way a soldier learns to march, correctly from long drilling and at some cost. "You have not changed at all, Miss Marchmont." "I have changed a great deal, sir. I am 10 years older, I have buried my father, I have watched my brother inherit a title he manages the way a boy manages a top he does not understand, and I have refused 3 perfectly respectable offers of marriage on grounds I have never once explained to my own mother's satisfaction. If that does not constitute change, I do not know what would satisfy you." She had meant it to sting a little, to make him understand in the space of one sentence, precisely how much ground had passed beneath both of them since the orchard, and she saw it land, saw something flinch behind the careful composure before he mastered it again, and for one unguarded instant she thought he might simply turn and walk back out through the door he had come in by, and take the last 10 years' worth of unspoken things with him. Instead he held out his hand. "Will you dance with me, Miss Marchmont?" "I have not danced in 4 years, Sir James. I have grown very fond of this chair." "Then I shall have to persuade the chair to spare you for one set." His hand remained where it was, patient, and behind him she could see the whole room pretending very badly not to watch. Her mother frozen mid-gesture at the negus table, Aunt Hen sitting with the stillness of a woman who has learned that the surest way to see the second act of a drama is to make no sound whatsoever, and further off, half in shadow near the card-room door, her brother Frederick, whose face wore an expression she could not read at that distance and did not entirely like the shape of even from here. She looked back at James Hawke's outstretched hand, the same long fingers, brown now, a thin white scar across the knuckle of the first that had not been there 10 years ago and told its own quiet story of some other country, some other danger she had had no part in and no knowledge of, and she thought of 10 years of Sunday afternoons spent not walking to the orchard, 10 years of letters that had come thick and fast for 8 months and then, without warning or explanation, stopped. She put her hand in his anyway. She had never in her life been able to help it. The set was already forming as they crossed the floor, and Eleanor was distantly, uncomfortably aware of every eye in the room following them, of her mother's fan gone entirely still in her hand, of Mrs. Fenshaw leaning to whisper something urgent to her daughter that would, Eleanor did not doubt, be common property of the whole parish by breakfast. She kept her chin level and her eyes on James Hawke's cravat, which she noted with a small, unwilling flicker of the old fondness was exactly as crooked as it had always been, 10 years and a fortune having apparently done nothing whatsoever to teach him the proper tying of a knot. "You are staring at my neckcloth," he observed as the fiddles struck up and the first figure drew them together. "It is crooked. It has been crooked since you walked in the door. I begin to think it is crooked on principle. My valet in Bombay was a very fine fellow in every particular except this one, and I confess I never troubled to correct him, on the theory that a man returning home after 10 years ought to arrive looking at least a little like himself, and not entirely reformed into someone his own mother would fail to recognize." His hand found her waist as the figure turned them, light and correct and entirely proper, and yet she felt the warmth of it straight through the thin autumn muslin as though there were nothing at all between his palm and her skin. "You danced beautifully once, Miss Marchmont. I hope 4 years of chair-keeping have not entirely undone the habit. I recall a good deal more argument accompanying our dancing than compliments, sir. I begin to wonder if India has softened you." "India has done a great many things to me. Softening was not among the more prominent." Something passed behind his eyes then, quick as a fish turning beneath still water, gone before she could properly examine it. "I find I have grown considerably harder to startle, and considerably easier to disappoint, and I do not know yet which of those is the more inconvenient change. You have grown cryptic. I preferred you when you simply told me I was wrong about Mrs. Radcliffe and let me argue you out of it over the course of an afternoon. I have not changed my opinion of Mrs. Radcliffe in the smallest degree, Miss Marchmont, whatever else 10 years may have altered. I maintain that the Mysteries of Udolpho wants a firmer editor and a shorter list of fainting spells, and I am prepared to defend the position at length, precisely as I once did, if you will only give me leave to call and resume the quarrel properly." She might have laughed, had the whole of the room not been so plainly straining to overhear them, had her brother not been standing near the card-room door with an expression she still could not read and liked less with every passing minute, had 10 years of silence not sat between every light word they exchanged like a held breath neither of them had yet found the courage to release. As it was, she managed only, "You may call, Sir James, though I make no promise as to how the argument will go, since I have had 10 years to sharpen my opinions and no gentleman of sense to blunt them against in your absence." "Then I shall count myself fortunate to arrive already at a disadvantage," he said, and turned her once more beneath his arm as the set closed, "for I find I have missed nothing in 10 years half so much as being told, plainly and without flattery, exactly how wrong I am." The music ended, the room applauded as rooms do, and beneath the cover of it Eleanor caught, over James Hawke's shoulder, the particular stillness of her brother's face, not pleasure, not even the ordinary irritation of a man watching his sister draw attention he had not sanctioned, but something colder and more considering, gone so quickly into an easy smile that she told herself, walking back to her chair with her heart still unsteady from the dance, that she had surely imagined it. She had not imagined it. She would understand, before the month was out, precisely what that stillness had meant, and precisely how long her brother had been standing in the wings of her own quiet grief, arranging its every silence to his own private advantage. But that November evening, with the fiddles tuning up for the next set and James Hawke bowing over her hand a moment longer than convention strictly permitted, she knew only that the safe, small architecture of her overlooked life had cracked clean through in the space of a single dance, and that there was no further use in pretending otherwise. 10 years is a long time to a girl of 18, though it does not feel so at the start of it. It felt, in the spring she turned 18, like the whole of forever laid out before her in the shape of one particular young man, the second son of the vicar of the next parish, who had nothing to recommend him to her father beyond good manners, a good seat on a horse, and a habit of turning up at the bottom of the orchard at Marchmont Grange with a book under his arm and an expression that suggested he had walked 3 miles specifically for the pleasure of arguing with her about it. James Hawke had been newly down from Oxford with a head full of Latin and no living to inherit, his father having only the one small parish and an elder Br. already comfortably settled in it. He had come to call on the Marchmonts because his mother and Eleanor's mother had been at school together 40 years before, and he had stayed that first afternoon, A full 2 hours past the point politeness required, arguing with the 17-year-old Miss Marchmont about whether Mrs. Radcliffe's novels did more harm than good to the female understanding, a question upon which Eleanor held violent and entirely contradictory opinions depending on which novel had most recently kept her up past midnight. "You are wrong," she had told him on that first afternoon, with the particular ferocity of a girl who has not yet learned that gentlemen do not care to be told so. "I generally am," he had said, entirely unoffended, "though I confess I have rarely been told so quite so quickly. Most young ladies wait at least until the second visit." "I saw no reason to waste your time, sir, when I might correct you at once." He had laughed, that same laugh she would hear again 10 years later in an assembly room and feel go through her like a struck bell, surprised and whole, the laugh of a man who has not expected to be met head-on and finds, to his own visible astonishment, that he likes it enormously, and he had come back the following week and the week after that, until calling at Marchmont Grange on a Tuesday afternoon became so settled a habit between them that the servants had stopped announcing him at all and simply showed him through to wherever Miss Eleanor happened to be. They had fallen in love the way people do at 17 and 20, entirely, recklessly, and without the smallest regard for the practicalities that would eventually be required to sustain it. By midsummer they had an understanding that involved no ring and no settlement and had been sealed, instead, in the hollow of the old oak at the bottom of the orchard, the wishing oak, the local children called it, for a split in its trunk wide enough to hide a note in, a habit dating back 3 generations of Marchmont children leaving messages for each other that they were too shy to say aloud. "I have nothing to offer your father," James had told her there, on an August evening with the last of the light going gold and slant through the apple boughs, "beyond a very good opinion of my own eventual prospects, which I grant you is not generally considered legal tender. My father is a baronet with 4,000 a year and a son to provide for. He will want a settlement, and you will not have one for years if ever, and we both know it. I know it very well. It is the chief occupation of my nights, knowing it." He had taken her hand then, turned it over, and pressed something into her palm, a plain gold ring, unadorned, small enough to have been a boy's signet cut down, with a single word engraved inside the band where only she would ever see it. "Remember, it is not a betrothal ring. I would not insult your father by pretending it were, when I have nothing to back the promise but my own 2 hands. But I am going to India, Eleanor. My uncle has a position for me in Bombay in the company's service, and if I work as hard as I mean to, I will come home in 5 years or 7 at the very outside, with enough behind me to ask your father properly and not before. I am asking you now in this orchard, where no one but the oak can hear me, to wait, not because I have any right to ask it, because I love you more than I have loved anything in my life, and I find I cannot bear to leave without at least trying to ask." She had wept a little and been furious with herself for it, and pressed a sprig of rosemary from beneath the kitchen garden wall into the pages of the small prayer book he carried everywhere, because rosemary was for remembrance and she had been raised on enough of her grandmother's garden lore to know it, and she had said yes, because she had never in her short life been able to help saying yes to James Hawke about anything, even the things, especially the things, that frightened her most. He had sailed from Portsmouth in September. She had stood at the bottom of the orchard at the Wishing Oak, and watched the lane long after the dust of his hired chaise had settled, and told herself 5 years, 7 at the outside, was no great length of time at all for a girl who meant to spend the whole of her life with the man at the other end of it. She had not known, standing there in the last of that September light with the ring warm from her own palm slipped onto a ribbon beneath her bodice where her mother would not see it, that she was about to learn precisely how long 10 years could be made to feel, when every single one of them arrived without him in it. The letters had come at first the way a tide comes in, steadily, faithfully, twice a month and sometimes more, thick packets crossed with his cramped, hurried hand, full of Bombay's heat and the company's ledgers and, buried always somewhere in the middle of the dry commercial business, some private sentence meant only for her, folded so carefully into the ordinary that a careless reader would have passed over it entirely. The rains have come at last, and I confess I thought of nothing so much, watching them, as the way you stood in the orchard the day it stormed and refused to come inside until the lightning had quite finished, on the grounds that you had never yet seen it strike anyone you knew and did not intend to miss the first occasion. She had answered every one. She had kept them in a rosewood box her grandmother had left her, wrapped in ribbon, sorted by month, and she had gone to the Wishing Oak on the first Sunday of every month regardless of weather, because it had been their habit before he left, and habits, she found, were the only thing that made an absence bearable. The shape of him fitted still into the ordinary days, even with the man himself 6,000 miles away. For 8 months the letters had come. And then in the 9th month they had simply stopped. She had told herself at first that it was the post, that ships went down, that packets were lost, that the crossing from Bombay was a long and uncertain thing, and 8 months of faithful correspondence did not undo itself over a single silent quarter. She had gone on writing, she had gone on walking to the orchard on the first Sunday of every month, rain or shine, until the neighbors had begun to remark upon it, gently at first and then less gently, and her father, in the last winter of his life, had taken her hand by the fire one evening and said, not unkindly, that a young man who meant to keep his word did not generally allow a full year to pass without a single line to the woman he had left it with, and that there were other offers, and he would not live forever to see her settled. She had gone on waiting anyway. Not because she believed any longer in any particular certainty that he would come, that certainty had worn thin and then worn through somewhere in the second silent year, but because she found, when she examined the alternative honestly, that she would rather be an old maid who had waited for nothing than a wife who had settled for someone she did not love in order to prove she had stopped hoping. It was not romance by the 5th year. It had long since stopped being romance. It was simply the shape her life had taken, the way a river takes the shape of the ground it has worn, and she no longer knew how to be any other shape than the one 10 years of Sunday walks to an orchard had carved her into. Her father had died in the 6th year. Frederick had inherited the baronetcy, the 4,000 a year, and, though it took the family the better part of 2 years to discover the full extent of it, a set of debts run up at cards and worse that had been quietly eating away at the estate's credit since before their father was even cold in the ground. Eleanor had watched her brother's face grow thinner and his eyes grow more evasive with each passing season, had watched the tenant farms go a little more neglected each year, the roof of the west wing go a little more visibly in want of mending, and had said nothing because it was not her place to say it, and because Frederick, when cornered on the subject, had a way of turning conversations back upon her own unmarried state with a swiftness that suggested he had rehearsed the maneuver. You might have married Price 2 years ago and spared us all a great deal of inconvenience, he had told her once, not quite drunk but not quite sober either, in the library at Marchmont Grange with the fire burned low. He is not a romantic figure, I grant you, but he has 10,000 a year from those mills of his, and he has asked you twice, and I do not understand what precisely you are holding out for beyond the general principle of being disagreeable. I am holding out, she had told him, with more heat than she generally permitted herself, for the general principle of not marrying a man I feel nothing for, in order to settle debts I did not incur, to spare a comfort I have never once been consulted about. He had not answered that. He had only looked at her, in the low firelight, with an expression she had put down at the time to ordinary brotherly resentment, and it was not until much later, not until the autumn Sir James Hawke came home a baronet with £30,000, that she would come to understand precisely what had been sitting behind that look, and how long it had been sitting there, and how much of the last 10 years it had quietly, methodically arranged. Eleanor heard the carriage before she saw it, good wheels on the gravel, a set of matched bays far finer than anything the lane usually saw, and she stood at the parlor window with her hands folded and her heart going a great deal harder than she considered dignified, and watched Sir James Hawke hand himself down and stand a moment in the drive looking up at the house with an expression she could not read. Her mother received him with a warmth so immediate and so complete that Eleanor felt her own face heat with second-hand mortification. Lady Marchmont had spent 10 years quietly mourning the loss of a penniless second son as a prospective connection and had spent the last fortnight recalculating, with visible and increasingly transparent delight, precisely how differently the family might regard the same young man now that he arrived attached to a baronetcy and 30,000 a year, and she made no particular effort to disguise the shift. Sir James. What an honor. What an unlooked-for honor, I am sure. We had heard, of course, of your uncle's passing, and offer our condolences, though I confess we had not looked for you to inherit quite so. That is to say, we are all of us delighted, are we not, Eleanor? Do stop standing there like the parlor clock and make your curtsy. I have already had the pleasure of Miss Marchmont's curtsy at the assembly, ma'am, James said, with a courtesy so smooth it very nearly concealed the way his eyes went at once to Eleanor and stayed there. I wonder, if it is not too great an imposition, whether I might beg a quarter hour of her time in the garden. There are matters from some years ago I find myself wishing to settle properly, now that I am in a position to settle anything at all, and I would rather speak of them where four walls cannot repeat the conversation over the tea things for a fortnight. Lady Marchmont would have granted him the contents of the house and a ladder to carry it away. Within minutes Eleanor found herself steered out through the low garden door into the thin autumn sunshine, the last of the roses gone leggy and brown-edged along the wall, the beech hedge dropping its first gold leaves in a slow, unhurried drift across the gravel path, and James Hawke walking beside her with his hands clasped behind his back in the particular stillness of a man rehearsing, silently, a speech he had carried a very long way. "You did not answer my letters," he said, once they had reached the sundial and the parlor window was safely behind them, and there was no preamble in it at all, no easing into the thing, only the plain question, laid down between them the way he had once laid down his opinions about Mrs. Radcliffe, entirely without regard for how much it might cost either of them to hear it. Eleanor stopped walking. "I beg your pardon?" "After the 9th month. I wrote every fortnight without fail for the better part of 2 years, and then less often as I began to understand what your silence meant, but I never once stopped entirely, not in 10 years, Eleanor, and I confess I had rehearsed a great many versions of this conversation on the voyage home, and in not one of them did you look at me as though I had asked you something in a foreign tongue." The garden seemed to go very still around her. Somewhere beyond the hedge a robin was singing its thin autumn song, unconcerned, and Eleanor stood with the cold beginning somewhere beneath her ribs and said very carefully, "I wrote to you every month for 2 years after your letters stopped, Sir James. I walked to the Wishing Oak on the first Sunday of every month for 10 years, in case a letter should come to it the way we once left our foolish notes there as children, and I received precisely 3 replies from Bombay in the whole of that time, each of them shorter and colder than the last, until the third one informed me, in terms I have not forgotten and do not care to repeat, that you had found the position offered you by a Mr. Hollis of the company sufficiently agreeable that you saw no further profit in maintaining a correspondence better suited to people with less pressing claims upon their time." James Hawke had gone very white. "I wrote no such letter." "I have it still, sir. I did not imagine it, nor did I misread your hand, which I had by then had a full year to study." "Then it was not my hand." His voice had dropped, gone rough at the edges in a way that frightened her more than anger would have, because it was not anger at all, it was the sound of a man watching the floor of his own certainty give way beneath him. "Eleanor, I received exactly 1 letter from you after the 9th month, and it told me you had accepted an offer from a Mr. Price of this parish, that your father was pleased with the connection, and that you begged me not to trouble myself with any further correspondence that might embarrass either of us. I have carried that letter 6,000 miles and back again. I could show it to you this hour if you wished it, though God knows I have not had the courage to read it twice in the whole of the last decade." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The robin sang on indifferent in the hedge. And Eleanor Marchmont, standing in her mother's garden with the cold October sun on her shoulders, felt the entire architecture of 10 years of quiet, patient grief tilt beneath her like ice giving way on a pond she had thought, until that instant, was perfectly solid ground. "I never wrote any such letter," she said. "I have never in my life accepted an offer from Mr. Price. I have refused him twice." "Then someone," said James Hawke very low, "has spent 10 years and a very great deal of trouble making certain that we should each believe the worst thing possible of the other, and I find, Miss Marchmont, that I have a very short list indeed of persons in this county with both the opportunity and the motive to have done it." Aunt Hen received the whole of it that evening with the stillness of a woman assembling a hand of cards she has suspected for some time was crooked, and had merely been waiting for the proof to fall face up on the table. "Frederick," she said when Eleanor had finished, "has had the handling of this family's correspondence since your father's health began to fail, which was rather sooner than any of us liked to admit at the time. He franked the letters. He collected the post from Aldermere himself, twice weekly, on the grounds that it was no trouble to him and saved the servants a journey. I have thought it an oddly diligent habit in a young man who could not be troubled to answer his own tailor's bills, and I confess I never once thought to ask myself why." "You cannot mean he read my letters." "He would not. Frederick is careless, aunt, and weak, and I have watched him gamble away half the estate's credit without a single pang of conscience that I could ever detect. But this is a different order of thing entirely. This is deliberate. This is cruel and sustained over 10 years, and I cannot make myself believe my own brother capable of it merely for the pleasure of it." "Not for the pleasure of it, no." Aunt Hen's fan had gone still in her lap, which was, in its way, more alarming than anything she might have said. "But your brother owes Mr. Price money, my dear. A very great deal of money, if the whispers from the card-room at the last race meeting are to be believed, run up over a matter of years and never once mentioned at this fireside, and Mr. Price is not a man who plays cards for the pleasure of losing gracefully. A connection by marriage would settle such a debt very neatly indeed, and quietly, in a manner that need never trouble a magistrate or a gentleman's reputation. I begin to think, Eleanor, that your brother has spent the better part of a decade very carefully making certain that the one obstacle standing between himself and that particular settlement, namely, a sister who had already given her heart elsewhere and meant to go on keeping it there, was persuaded, by whatever means came to hand, that the elsewhere in question had ceased to want it. Eleanor sat very still in the growing dark of the parlor, the fire burning low, and felt something that had been grief for 10 years turn, slowly and with a kind of terrible clarity, into something closer to fury. "I am going to want to see his desk," she said. "I rather thought you might. I have the key to the study already, as it happens, your father having given it to me some years before he died, on the theory, which I now think was a very sound one, that a sensible woman ought always to have a key to any room a Marchmont man means to keep locked." They went the following afternoon, while Frederick was at the race meeting with Mr. Price and half the county's more sporting gentlemen, and would not, Aunt Hen calculated with the precision of a woman who had tracked her nephew's habits for years without ever once being asked to be home before dark. The study smelled of old tobacco and older paper, the desk a great mahogany thing that had been their father's and his father's before him, its drawers fitted with brass locks that had rusted slightly at the edges from disuse and neglect rather than any particular vigilance on Frederick's part. Aunt Hen's key turned the lowest drawer on the second try, and Eleanor, kneeling on the worn carpet with her heart hammering somewhere up near her throat, drew it open and found, beneath a disorderly drift of unpaid bills and gaming vouchers marked in Frederick's own careless hand, a bundle of letters tied with ordinary string, addressed in a hand she had not seen in 10 years and would have known blindfolded among 1,000 others. There were 41 of them. She counted them twice, sitting on the floor of her brother's study with the autumn light going long and gold through the window, because she could not at first make her mind accept the number, 41 letters, most of them opened, the seals broken carelessly and never resealed, spanning very nearly the whole of the 10 years James Hawke had been in India, arriving with the same faithful regularity he had promised her in the orchard, and never once, in all that time, reaching the hands they had been written for. The last of them was dated only 4 months before, written from aboard ship on the crossing home, and it was this one Eleanor opened with fingers that would not quite hold steady. "I do not know if this will find you before I do, or after, or whether it will find you at all, given the silence of the last decade, which I have long since stopped attributing to the post and begun, God forgive me, to attribute to your own settled preference. But I find that 10 years and a fortune have not cured me of a single foolish sentiment I carried out of that orchard, and if I arrive in Aldermere to find you married and happy, I mean to trouble you with nothing beyond my sincere good wishes and the return, by whatever discreet means I can arrange, of a ring I have no further right to keep. And if I arrive to find you unmarried, I do not know what I shall do, Eleanor, beyond something considerably less dignified than a gentleman of my new consequence is meant to permit himself in public. I have thought of you every single day of the 10 years I have been gone. I do not expect that to matter to you now. I find I cannot make myself stop hoping that it might." She sat on the floor of her brother's study and wept at last properly for the first time in 10 years, not for the grief of the lost decade, which she had long since learned to carry quietly, but for the plain, furious, overwhelming relief of discovering that the whole of it had been a lie, that every silent Sunday at the Wishing Oak had been answered, all along, by a man 6,000 miles away writing the same faithful, foolish, unanswered letters into a void her own brother had built and maintained, brick by careful brick, for the sake of a gambling debt. Aunt Hen, standing at the window with her arms folded, said nothing at all for a long while, which from her was its own kind of eloquence. Then she said quite quietly, "We had better decide what is to be done before your brother comes home smelling of brandy and thinking himself very clever indeed, my dear, because I do not believe either of us is going to manage a calm conversation with him after 4 o'clock, and I should very much like this settled before nightfall." Frederick came home at 6:30, ruddy with brandy and a good day's winnings, and found his sister and his aunt sitting in his own study with the lamp lit and 41 letters spread across his desk in careful rows, and Eleanor watched every trace of easy self-satisfaction drain out of his face in the space of a single glance. "Sit down, Frederick." He sat. She had never in her life given her brother an order and had him obey it without argument, and the fact that he did so now, wordlessly, told her more clearly than any confession could have precisely how thoroughly he understood what she had found. "You have read them, I collect," he said at last into the silence, his voice gone small in a way she had not heard from him since he was a boy of 12 caught in some minor and long-forgiven mischief. "I have read enough of them. I should like to hear the rest from you, if you can bring yourself to it, though I confess I do not know that I shall ever quite manage to believe whatever you say, having spent 10 years discovering exactly how little your word has been worth. He put his head in his hands and for a long moment said nothing at all, and when he did speak, it came out of him in a low, unsteady rush, as though a wall long straining against a flood had finally, all at once, given way. Price held £4,000 of my paper by the time Father died, Eleanor. 4,000 and mounting because I could not stop. God knows I tried to stop, and each time I lost I told myself the next hand would put it right, and it never did, and by the second year of it Price had begun. Gently, you understand, never anything so crude as a threat, to remark over cards how very much he admired you, and how content he would be to consider certain debts a private family matter, quite forgotten, quite forgiven were a connection between our families ever to come about. I told myself, the first time he said it, that I would find some other way. I told myself that for a year, perhaps two. And then your Mr. Hawke's letters began arriving so thick and so constant that I understood, well before you ever admitted it to yourself, precisely how settled your own affections were, and I understood that so long as that correspondence continued, Price's private family matter would never come about, and you stole them. I told myself I was only delaying them. At first, I told myself I would send them on eventually, once matters with Price were easier, once I had won back enough to clear the debt honestly and there was no longer any need. But there was always a need, Eleanor. There was never one single month in 10 years that there was not a need, and by the third year I had begun answering a few of the early ones myself, in a hand near enough your own that neither of you troubled to examine it too closely, because you had no reason yet to doubt each other. And forgery is a great deal easier the first time than the 50th, though God knows it never once got easier for me in any sense that signified. His voice cracked. I told him you were married. I told you he no longer wanted you. I have told two people who loved each other more faithfully than I have ever loved anything in my life that the other had simply stopped, and I have done it for 10 years, sober and drunk both, because I was a coward with cards and had not the courage to be anything better with the consequences. The fire popped low in the grate. Aunt Hen by the window said nothing at all, though her knuckles had gone white on the folded fan in her lap. What do you mean to do? Frederick said at last, not quite able to lift his head. Now that you know it? I mean, said Eleanor, and found to her own faint surprise that her voice had gone perfectly steady, to marry Sir James Hawke at the earliest date the law will permit, with or without your blessing, which I no longer require and no longer particularly want. And I mean to tell him the whole of it, every letter, every forged line, the exact shape of what you did and why, because I have spent 10 years grieving a silence that was never real, and I will not spend one more day carrying a lie on your behalf, Frederick, not even to spare you the shame of having it known. You built this. You may live in the ruins of it as honestly as the rest of us are now obliged to. She gathered the letters into their string, all 41 of them, and left her brother sitting alone in the lamplight with his winnings from the race meeting still in his coat pocket and the whole of 10 years' cowardice laid bare across his own desk, and did not look back to see what his face did once the door had shut behind her. She sent word to Whitcomb Park the following morning, a single line asking Sir James Hawke to meet her at the Wishing Oak at 4 o'clock, if he could spare the time, on a matter she did not care to commit further to paper than that. He was there before her. She saw him from the top of the orchard, standing beneath the old split trunk with his hat in his hand and his coat collar turned up against the first real cold of the season, and something in the set of his shoulders, braced, uncertain, a man expecting bad news and standing to receive it as steadily as he could manage, told her that 10 years of silence had taught him, as it had taught her, to hope for very little and prepare for the worst. She did not speak at first. She walked down through the wet grass with the bundle of letters held against her chest, and when she reached him she simply held them out, and watched his face change as he understood, by degrees, what he was looking at, the string, the familiar seals, his own hand on the direction of the topmost letter, unopened these 4 years, never once reaching the woman it had been written for. 41, she said, when he seemed unable to make himself speak. I have not counted the ones you say you received of mine, but I imagine when we compare them, we will find a similarly small and similarly poisoned number. My brother owed Mr. Price £4,000, James, and has spent the whole of the last decade making certain neither of us ever learned the other still wanted what we had promised in this orchard 10 years ago, because my marrying elsewhere was the only coin he had to pay that debt with. James Hawke sat down quite suddenly on the low stone wall beneath the oak, as though his legs had simply stopped consulting him on the matter, and held the letters in both hands the way a man holds something he has been told is not real and cannot quite believe, now that it is placed in his own grip, that it is solid after all. 10 years, he said very low. I stood on the deck of that ship 4 months ago and told myself I was a fool for hoping that a woman does not remain unmarried at 28 out of sentiment for a man who plainly stopped writing to her within the first year, and I made myself believe it, Eleanor, because it hurt a great deal less than the alternative, which was that you had simply never received a single word I sent for 10 years, while I sat in Bombay believing myself forgotten and telling myself I deserved to be. He looked up at her, and his eyes were wet in a way she had never once seen them, not even at the stile in the rain the day he sailed. You waited. I did not know I was waiting for anything real by the end of it. I want you to understand that plainly, because I will not have this begin on a prettier footing than the truth allows. By the 5th year I no longer believed you would come. I waited because I found I did not know how to be any other shape than the one your absence had worn into me, and because every man who offered for me in the meantime asked for a version of affection I discovered I simply did not have left to give anyone else. I did not wait out of faith, James. I waited out of habit and grief and a kind of stubbornness I am not entirely proud of. But I never once stopped wearing this. She drew the ribbon from beneath her collar, and on it, worn smooth from 10 years against her skin, hung the plain gold ring he had given her at this same oak on an August evening a decade gone, the single word still legible inside the band where her thumb had traced it 1,000 sleepless nights. Remember. James Hawke came off the wall and crossed the short space between them and took her face in both his hands. The same long fingers, brown now, the thin white scar catching the last of the afternoon light, and looked at her for a long moment as though he were memorizing her against the possibility that this, too, might yet prove to be some cruel and elaborate mistake. I never stopped, he said. Not for one single day of it, Eleanor. I want that understood as plainly as you have insisted upon your own truth. I did not wait out of stubbornness. I waited because there was never, in 10 years and half the world's distance, a single morning I woke up wanting anyone else, and I have come home a baronet with £30,000 I would trade back for nothing at all if it meant I had never lost a single one of those years with you in it. Then you had better ask me properly, said Eleanor, with the ghost of her old ferocity finding its way back into her voice at last, because you asked me once in this exact spot with nothing to your name, and I said yes before you had finished the sentence, and I find I am rather looking forward to seeing what you do with the advantage of actually having something to offer this time. He laughed, the old laugh, whole and unguarded and startled loose of him all at once, exactly as it had been the very first afternoon he ever crossed swords with her over Mrs. Radcliffe, and got down, without the smallest regard for the wet grass and his good travelling coat, onto one knee beneath the wishing oak, and asked her, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence, exactly as she had the first time, because in 10 years and 6,000 miles, it seemed, that particular habit had never once worn away. Frederick did not attend the wedding, which was held in December in the small stone church at Aldermere with rather more haste than the band strictly required, on the grounds, as Aunt Hen put it, with some asperity, that a bride and groom who had already waited 10 years longer than any reasonable couple ought to be asked to wait were not to be troubled with further delay for the sake of anybody's convenience but their own. He had gone, in fact, within a week of the confrontation in his study, to settle what remained of his debt to Mr. Price through the sale of a smaller parcel of land at the edge of the estate that their father had always meant to leave in trust, and Frederick, in his shame, insisted upon sacrificing outright rather than accept a shilling more of anyone's forgiveness he had not earned. He wrote to Eleanor from Bath, where he had gone to take the waters and, by his own account, to sit with what he had done until he had grown honest enough to be fit company again, and though the letter was awkward and the reconciliation it began was a slow one, it was, Aunt Hen observed with some satisfaction, considerably more than she had expected of him, and a great deal better than nothing. Mr. Price, for his part, took the settlement of the debt and the loss of his hoped-for connection with a philosophical shrug that suggested he had regarded the whole scheme, from the beginning, as a reasonably good business arrangement rather than a matter of the heart, and was married himself within the year to a widow from Derby with a comfortable fortune of her own and considerably less complicated feelings about the transaction than Eleanor had ever managed to. It was the following autumn, almost exactly a year to the day since Sir James Hawke had walked back through the door of the Aldermere Assembly Rooms and stopped a room full of strangers cold, that Eleanor sat once more in her old chair by the long window, hers now by right of long habit rather than any need to hide in it, with her husband's hand resting warm over hers on the arm of the chair, and watched the same tired fiddles scrape out the same country dances they had played for 30 years and would likely go on playing for 30 more. "You are brooding," said Aunt Hen, arriving at her elbow exactly as she always had, in the same rustle of grey silk, though her smile these days came a good deal more easily than it once had. "I am resting," said Eleanor, and being, for once in my life, entirely honest about how happy it makes me to do it in company, which I believe is new. Outside the long window, where the reflection of the whole bright room still hung suspended in the dark autumn glass exactly as it had a year before, a single robin had settled on the sill despite the lateness of the season, regarding the whole warm, candlelit assembly with the same frank and unbothered contempt its kind always seemed to reserve for human celebration, and stayed there a good while, quite unconcerned, before it flew. If you have ever waited for someone the world had quietly told you to forget, if you have ever kept a promise long after every sensible voice around you insisted the other side of it was surely broken, this story was for you. Thank you for spending this while by the fire with me. If Eleanor and her patient baronet warmed your heart tonight, stay on a little longer. Subscribe and I shall keep the candles lit for the next tale.